Pasanties vaino, meden halos solo po, pros holigon estitatie, totelos chronos apai. Welcome back to another video on classical Greece. That was the Song of Sikilos, which is the oldest musical composition ever found in the world. And that gets us into our next series of big questions. The first big question we need to be able to answer after watching this video is, in what ways did the Greeks' understanding of their world represent a continuity to the past? And in what ways did their understanding of their world start to represent a fundamental change? And then the next big question, what were the lasting effects of Alexander the Great's conquest? So in what ways did the Greeks' understanding of their world represent a continuity to the past, and in what ways did it start to represent a change? So, like societies before the Greeks, many Greeks were polytheists, meaning they worshipped multiple gods. They believed that their gods were in control of the forces of nature, much like the gods that we saw in Mesopotamia, in ancient Egypt. Their gods had human-like appearances, emotions, and behaviors. So in the same way that the Mesopotamian gods were kind of mean and moody sometimes, so too were the Greek gods. Their myths, if you've read them, are full of drama. It's like, you're on the set of a soap opera. So they viewed their gods in a very human-like ways. Now, their gods lived on Mount Olympus, which is an actual mountain in northern Greece, and the Greeks composed these myths as a way of explaining the unknown in nature, in the same way that previous societies oftentimes explained the reason that they had a bad harvest was because their particular god was upset at them. So if the Greeks' views about their gods and the spirits that are in control of forces of nature represent a continuity to the past, we also start to see Greek thinkers in this period developing some new ideas that are eventually going to form an ideology known as Greek rationalism. So some Greeks sought to understand their world through more logic and empirical observation, weren't satisfied with explanations like, the river is flooding, so the gods must be upset with us today. Instead, they sought more logical and empirical reasons or rationale for the way their world was. And they focused on observation as a way of trying to achieve a deeper understanding of their world. So instead of viewing their world through kind of a religious lens, they started to view their world in more secular terms. So the word secular, a really important word, it means non-religious. So they sought a more secular explanation for their world rather than a spiritual explanation. And we see this in the series of philosophers, starting with Socrates and then Plato and Aristotle. Now, this Greek rationalism essentially plants a seed which will later develop into the scientific revolution. So it's that idea that you can understand your world through science and empirical observation rather than through exclusively spiritual explanations, which is going to spread from Greece to other places like the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic caliphates. We'll study how these Greek ideas eventually migrate and filter their way into other societies who are going to build upon those ideas, and then eventually a lot of those ideas are going to return back to Europe and lead to the flourishing of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment later on in the course. Now, when it comes to Greek philosophy, another thing that you need to know is that the Greeks really viewed the world as a series of hierarchical beings. At the very top, you had God, angels, demons. You had these divine beings, supernatural beings. Below them, you had humans, and within the realm of humans, they had a distinction between man, who was higher in nature than woman. And so we saw that before at the quote from Aristotle about Athenian patriarchy. Below them, you had animals, and then below animals you had plants, and then at the very bottom you had inanimate objects like rocks or minerals. Now, when it comes to Greek art and architecture, first you should be able to recognize it and identify it. And here are two typical examples of classical Greek sculpture and architecture. So on the left we have a piece showing the goddess Artemis hunting. Notice a couple of aspects of Greek sculpture, incredibly realistic looking. You notice the way in which her dress seems to flow. You can see those lines that suggest movement, which makes it incredibly realistic looking. So on the right you see an image showing the Parthenon, a building that was at the center of Athens. And one of the classic things whenever you want to be able to identify Greek architecture are those Greek columns, which make the building seem like it's almost carved out of the rock itself. So you need to be able to recognize Greek art and also identify how it reflects the values of their culture and their society. So shifting gears, what were the lasting effects of Alexander the Great's conquest? That's another big question we need to be able to answer. So the Greek city-states were at war with one another in the Peloponnesian Wars, eventually weakening each other. This is going to allow another region of Greece, the Macedonians, to come in and conquer the Greek city-states in 337 BCE. This conquest was led by Philip II, who had developed some advanced military technologies and strategies. So I'll let the band Iron Maiden explain what happened next. So if you couldn't understand that man who was screaming, he described how at the age of 19, Alexander the Great took over for his father, the Macedonian army. He then began a series of military conquests into Anatolia, right here, modern-day Turkey, down into Egypt, and then over here into Persia, defeating the Persian Achaemenid army and forming what sometimes is referred to as Alexander's Empire, or sometimes referred to as the Macedonian Empire. And it's a massive empire in the same way that the Persian Empire was, covering 3 continents, Asia, Eastern Europe, and also North Africa. He also had a fondness for naming things after himself, so a number of cities in that region are named Alexandria, including the famous Alexandria in Egypt. He also named one city after his horse named Bucephalus. Now, one of the reasons why Alexander the Great is so important is because he spread Greek Hellenistic culture all the way to India. And you can see this in this particular coin. On the front, you see Greek writing. On the back, you see Korosti, which is an Indian script. You also see the Greek goddess Athena on the back. So this is a classic example of syncretism, the blending of 2 cultural traditions, both local Indian culture and Greek culture. He also then unified Eurasia and allowed for trade to begin spreading across the Silk Road. So Alexander, upon his death at a fairly young age, his empire was divided up. He was a very good military leader and strategist, but he wasn't a great empire builder, meaning he didn't put into place structures that you need to in order to create a lasting empire, like bureaucracy or common systems. And so Alexander's empire upon his death was divided up into the Seleucid Empire, which composed of mostly what was the former Persian Empire, the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt, and the Antigonid Empire in Greece and Macedonia. So as a result of watching this video, you should be able to answer these big questions. In what ways did the Greeks' understanding of their world represent a continuity to the past? And in what ways did their thinking begin to represent a change? And then in what were the lasting effects of Alexander the Great's conquest? Thanks for watching.